Show your support. Like, share and subscribe.
Hello, I am That British Guy and welcome back to Hidden Gems. In this series I take a look at some of the games we may have forgotten about over time, or ones that potentially slipped us by upon their release. This week I am looking at Final Fantasy XIII-2. Now the main reason this may have slipped by most people is because of its predecessor Final Fantasy XIII. It released to quite a bit of fanfare, and once players kind of got to grips with it, it wasn't quite what was expected. It was very linear, it was very not Final Fantasy-esque, and this probably put quite a lot of people off of the rest of the series. So what exactly is Final Fantasy XIII-2? Well, before we discuss XIII-2, we must very briefly look at 13 in order to get a fuller understanding of the game. Essentially, you control 6 characters who are blessed with certain special abilities by something called a Fal'Cie, and this turns your characters into Fal'Cie. And with these extra abilities, they are charged with fulfilling a task, and if they fulfill that task, then that will stop them from turning into monsters. However, when they do fulfill their task, they will turn into crystal. And the reason these 6 people are trying to kind of fulfill this, and the reason they come together, is because of the protagonist of XIII-2, a girl called Sarah. Now, long story short, the 6 characters in 13 are tasked with destroying the world, and through various kind of contrived means they manage to avoid that, defeat the big bad at the end and save the world. They save Sarah from her crystal tomb effectively, but at the very end her sister Lightning, who is the main character in 13, gets kind of sucked out of time into a kind of in-between space. Now fast forward to XIII-2, which starts 3 years later. Everyone has kind of left the old ways behind. They were all very dependent on these kind of magical beings, these Fal'Cie, to make their life easier. So they are trying to move away from that type of life as much as possible. Sarah is now a school teacher, but is missing her older sister. However, something is clearly not quite right because everybody remembers things slightly different to how she does. And she is joined by our other main character, Noel, who is effectively the last human alive very far into the future, about 700 odd years into the future. He is the last human being alive, and he is tasked with protecting a seer called Yule. He comes into contact with Lightning right near the beginning of the game and basically gets sent back to Sarah's time in order to help her fix the world. Because basically what's happened in the first game is it's caused lots of kind of time paradoxes, and what you end up doing is jumping through time to all these different places throughout the world's history, and you are tasked with trying to fix these time paradoxes. And at the same time, the main villain, Caius, is seemingly trying to bring the world to ruin by disrupting the timelines as much as he can. Now, I won't go into the reasons as to why he does this, or how he does this, or how this is linked to anything, because it is quite a big spoiler for the main story going forward. But needless to say, you have to keep essentially following him through time. You keep coming across him and fixing the mistakes that he is trying to make. The main characters from the first game, the 6 that you control, do make reappearances here in some form or another, and some more significant than others. But essentially it is just Sarah and Noel. They are your main characters here. Now in 13 you had a party of 3. And as you can see here, Sarah and Noel are only 2 people. So your party of 3 is supplemented by monsters. When you fight certain monsters, sometimes you gain their crystal, and that means you kind of get a friendly one of those on your side, and you can level them up with certain items. Sarah and Noel, however, level up the same way as 13 with ability points and a grid, and you go through this grid to add certain abilities within their different classes, effectively. And they are all the same as 13. You have your Commando, who is essentially just kind of big, strong attacks. Ravager, which is sort of magical based attacks. A Medic, who is obviously your healer. A Sentinel, who is your high defense person, who kind of soaks up all of the damage from your enemies. A Synergist, who uses kind of support magic to help the party. And a Saboteur, who uses support magic to hinder the opposition. And unlike in 13, where certain people were fixed to certain ones and you kind of had to balance your party depending on who you had, pretty much at the outset, Noel and Sarah are able to use all 6. But in order to restrict your party ever so slightly, you are only able to use 3 different monsters, and they are fixed to only one type. So there is still that element of restriction there. In terms of the actual battle mechanics and the gameplay, it's basically the same as 13. You have your mini-map up in the corner. You pick which class setout you want in the main menu and what configuration of that, and you are able to jump between 6 different setups whenever you like throughout the game. You only actually ever control one character, either Sarah or Noel, and the others kind of fight within their class as set. In each section there are certain portals, and basically you have to find the item, usually by beating some kind of a boss, to unlock that portal so that you can get through into the next area. So there's no kind of world map as such, because obviously you're jumping from place to place and time to time. 1 minute you might be in kind of the year 10, which is 10 years after the events of the first game. They call it AF, after the fall. So you might be in 10 AF and then you go through and you're in 100 AF, and then you might go forward again to 500 AF and then back again to like 200 AF. Sometimes there are times when you visit the same place in different parts of its own history, so things will be ever so slightly different. And you will meet characters and experience things in a very different order, because obviously the NPCs that you meet are working through normally, chronologically, and you are jumping all over the place. For me, as a bit of a sci-fi nerd, that was quite a nice little extra addition. It just adds something a bit different to the main series. It makes things feel a little bit less linear as well, because although each section is a kind of linear-esque map, once you unlock a few of them and you kind of have to start some of these missions in one area and then maybe find an alternative version of that place to finish that mission off, you can kind of jump backwards and forwards as and when you like, and that kind of removes that linearity from the game. As I said, gameplay wise is pretty much the same as 13. However, they did manage to remove the very annoying mechanic that was in the original game, whereby you can only control your party leader, and if they die, it's a game over. Even if your other 2 characters are okay. If your other 2 characters die, you can revive them as the party leader, but if your party leader dies, you're knackered. The way they get round this is, if you're controlling Sarah and she dies, you can automatically then start controlling Noel and revive Sarah. You can also, in battle, decide to swap between one or other, or in the menu between one or other, as you see fit. Obviously, if both Sarah and Noel die and you've only got your monster left, then it is game over. But at least it gives you that second chance that you didn't have in the previous game. Also, I think I prefer the versatility, the fact that both of those 2 characters can learn all 6 job classes. You are able to do that in 13, but it costs a hell of a lot of ability points, and you have to do a lot of grinding in order to open up those other 3. Essentially, each character has 3, and you then, right late in the game, unlock all of them for the other ones, but they don't know anything, and it's very expensive to learn any abilities in the other areas. The story does lead on directly from 13, but I wouldn't say it's necessarily vital for you to have played 13 in order to enjoy 13-2. The narrative itself is fairly self-contained, and because when 13 was originally written there was no intention of turning it into a series, this was effectively made to kind of appease the fans who were still waiting for Versus 13, which ended up becoming Final Fantasy XV. Because of that, the whole premise kind of had to develop in of itself. There were plenty of extra characters that only appeared in this game that had nothing to do with the previous game. They weren't overly hung up on the 6 characters from before. They are there, but really as supplementary characters. And the game does do enough to kind of explain enough of the events of the previous game so that you understand for the context of the sequel. It also does set up very nicely for Lightning Returns, which unfortunately I cannot speak of in as favourable a way. I have tried to play that game far too many times and just cannot get on with it. So that is Final Fantasy XIII-2. Certainly worth your time, especially if you're not so hung up on the old school turn-based style of RPG gaming. If you, like me, didn't mind 13, and I would never say it was the worst game in the world, I just wasn't overly blown away by it as I hoped I would have been, this is certainly a nice change of pace. It's a bit more fun, it's a bit more quirky, it takes all of the kind of cleanness of 13 and just develops it a little bit further. And also, if you've invested all that time into 13, it's nice to kind of see how things developed from there. Plus, it is very nice to spend a bit more time with Sarah in this game. She's a very strong focal point in 13, but you don't really see her very much, you just hear about her. So it's nice to actually experience what that character is. If you have any experience of this game, please let me know in the comments below. Also, if there are any hidden gems you think I might need to dig out, please let me know in the comments. Alternatively, you could let me know on Twitter at RightlyWrongly or on my Facebook page at ThatBritishGuy86. But until next time, I have been That British Guy and I will see you very soon. Goodbye.